There's a moment, and most people never notice it, when the world changes hands. Not with a war, not with a treaty, not with a speech, just quietly, like a tide pulling back, and suddenly the shore belongs to someone else. That moment happened once in your lifetime, maybe twice if you're old enough. And if you grew up in America, if you went to school here, paid taxes here, watched the news here, you probably felt it without knowing what it was. A sense that this country was supposed to lead, that it was built for it, that something in the architecture of America was designed, almost on purpose, to fill a vacuum that no one else could fill. You weren't wrong. But here's what they didn't teach you in school. Britain didn't lose its empire because it was weak. America didn't rise because it was simply stronger. What actually happened was stranger than that, more deliberate, more patient, and in some ways more ruthless than any war ever fought on open ground. This is the story of how one empire handed the world to another, and how the country that received it was ready even before it knew it was ready. Stay with me. Let's start with something that's hard to fully picture today. At its peak, the British Empire controlled roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface. 1 in 4 human beings alive on this planet answered in some form to London. Think about that for a second. Not Europe, not the West, the Earth. India, Australia, Canada, large portions of Africa, pieces of the Middle East, trading posts in China, naval stations scattered across every ocean like chess pieces on a board no one else was allowed to play on. The British didn't just have an empire, they had a system, a way of organizing the world that was so deeply embedded in trade routes, legal structures, financial institutions, and military positioning that removing it felt, to most people at the time, almost unthinkable. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. If you wanted to buy oil, cotton, or grain across international borders, you thought in pounds. London's financial houses set the price of capital for the entire globe. Lloyd's of London insured the ships that carried the goods that fed the cities that built the modern world. This wasn't just power, it was infrastructure. And here's what most people don't understand about infrastructure. It doesn't fall, it gets replaced. You don't tear down a bridge because it's old, you build another one, slightly wider, slightly stronger, and then quietly stop maintaining the first one. That's what America did. But to understand how, you have to understand what Britain actually was. Not the myth, but the machinery. Britain became dominant not because the British were smarter or braver than everyone else. They were organized, they were consistent, and they understood, earlier than most, that the real source of power in the modern world wasn't land, it was flow. The flow of goods, the flow of money, the flow of information. Whoever controlled the routes, the sea lanes, the telegraph cables, the port cities, controlled the century. Britain built its empire on choke points: Gibraltar, Suez, Singapore, Aden, Hong Kong, each one a hinge in the global door. Control the hinge and you don't need to own the whole door. For over a century, that logic was unassailable. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the logic started to bend. Not because Britain made a catastrophic mistake, not because some genius in Washington figured out a master plan, but because the world that made Britain powerful started to change shape. And Britain, for all its brilliance, was too invested in the old shape to move fast enough. That's the part no one talks about. Empires don't fall because they're defeated. They fall because they become loyal to a version of the world that no longer exists. America understood the new version before Britain did. Or maybe more accurately, America was the new version. There's a date that every American knows. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The attack that pulled the United States into the Second World War. But here's the thing about that date that history books tend to gloss over. By the time those Japanese planes appeared over Hawaii, America had already been quietly positioning itself for decades. Not for war, necessarily, but for what comes after war. Because someone in Washington, several someones actually, understood something that most of the world hadn't yet accepted. The Second World War wasn't just going to redraw borders, it was going to redraw everything. And whoever was standing when the smoke cleared would inherit the earth. Let's go back a little further, to 1914, the First World War. When that war began, Britain was still the undisputed center of the global financial system. The pound was king. London was the banker of the world. And Britain entered that war with confidence, the kind of confidence that comes from a century of dominance. What Britain didn't fully calculate was the cost, not the human cost, though that was catastrophic. Over 700,000 British soldiers dead, an entire generation of young men erased from the countryside. The financial cost. To fight a modern industrial war, Britain had to borrow, massively. And the country it borrowed from, the country with deep enough pockets to fund an empire at war, was the United States. By the end of the First World War, Britain had gone from being the world's largest creditor nation to one of its largest debtors. That shift, creditor to debtor, is not a footnote. It's the hinge. Because in the architecture of global power, the creditor doesn't just hold the debt. The creditor holds the leverage. The creditor sets the terms. The creditor decides, quietly and without announcement, who gets to keep playing and who gets asked to leave the table. America had become Britain's banker. And then came the Second World War. If the First World War cracked the foundation of British power, the Second World War demolished it. Britain fought magnificently. That's not in question. Churchill's speeches, the RAF in the Battle of Britain, the resilience of a civilian population under bombardment, these are real, and they matter. But resilience isn't the same as capacity. By 1941, Britain was exhausted, financially hollowed out, dependent on American supplies flowing across the Atlantic under a program called Lend-Lease, a name that sounds generous but was, in practice, a very sophisticated form of leverage. America wasn't giving Britain what it needed to survive, it was selling it, on terms that America wrote. And one of those terms, never stated loudly but understood clearly on both sides, was that the post-war world would not be organized around London. It would be organized around Washington. That negotiation didn't happen in a single room. It happened in 1,000 small moments, in diplomatic cables, in the fine print of financial agreements, in conversations between Roosevelt and Churchill, where one man was exhausted and the other was patient. Patient in the way that only a rising power can afford to be. Because patience, at that scale, is its own form of aggression. July 1944. The war in Europe isn't over yet. The beaches of Normandy are still fresh. Paris hasn't been liberated. The Pacific is still burning. And yet, 730 delegates from 44 nations travel to a small resort town in the mountains of New Hampshire, Bretton Woods. If you've never heard of it, that's not an accident. What happened in that hotel over 3 weeks in the summer of 1944 is one of the most consequential events in modern history and one of the least discussed at dinner tables. Because what they built there wasn't a peace treaty. It was a new operating system for the entire global economy. The men in that room understood something that most people, even today, struggle to fully grasp. Wars end, armies go home, borders get redrawn, but money never sleeps. And whoever controls the architecture of money, the rules, the institutions, the currency at the center of the system, controls something far more durable than any military victory. They control the peace. The chief negotiator for Britain was John Maynard Keynes. If you know economics, you know that name. One of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century. A man who had spent decades thinking about how money moves, how nations trade, how crises spread, and how they heal. Keynes arrived at Bretton Woods with a plan, an elegant plan, a plan that, in many ways, was genuinely visionary. He proposed a new global currency, not the dollar, not the pound, but something neutral, something he called the bancor, a synthetic unit of exchange that no single nation would control, a financial commons owned by everyone and therefore owned by no one. It was, in retrospect, an idea decades ahead of its time, and the Americans rejected it almost immediately. Not rudely, not with hostility, with the quiet, firm confidence of people who already know they've won. Because what America proposed instead was simpler, more direct, and entirely in America's favor. The dollar would become the world's reserve currency. Every other currency in the world would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself would be pegged to gold, at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce, giving the whole system an anchor of stability. Need to buy oil? Dollars. Need to settle an international debt? Dollars. Need to hold reserves in your central bank? Dollars. The institutions created at Bretton Woods, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, would be funded primarily by America. Headquartered in Washington, staffed, in their early decades, largely by Americans. Keynes fought. He argued. He was, by many accounts, the most brilliant person in that room. But he was negotiating from a position of dependency. Britain needed American money to rebuild. Britain needed American goodwill to maintain what remained of its global position. Britain needed, in ways both practical and painful, to keep Washington happy. And Washington knew it. So Keynes, exhausted, ill, arguing with everything he had, eventually conceded. He died less than 2 years later. Some who knew him said Bretton Woods broke something in him, that watching Britain's financial sovereignty transferred so deliberately and so completely to the other side of the Atlantic was more than a professional defeat. It was a kind of grief, because he understood, perhaps better than anyone in that room, what had just happened. The British era wasn't ending with a bang, it was ending with a signature. And in that signature, in the quiet, carpeted conference rooms of a New Hampshire mountain resort, the American century had officially begun. Not with soldiers, not with flags, with the rules that everyone else would now have to play by. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. After the Second World War, America did something that no dominant power in history had ever quite done before. It didn't just win, it rebuilt. The countries it had fought against, Germany, Japan, Italy, received American money, American expertise, American institutional support to reconstruct their economies from rubble. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, $16 billion, equivalent to roughly $200 billion today, pumped into a devastated Europe. Now, on the surface, this looks like generosity, and there was genuine idealism in it. Americans of that generation had a real belief, earned through sacrifice, that a stable world was worth paying for. But let's not be naive about the architecture underneath the generosity. Every country that received Marshall Plan money agreed to open its markets to American goods. Every country that entered the new Bretton Woods system anchored itself to the dollar. Every country that joined the emerging Western alliance accepted, to varying degrees, American military presence on its soil. Generosity and strategy, it turns out, are not opposites. They can be the same move, executed with enough patience and enough vision to make them indistinguishable. Think about what America built in the 2 decades after the war. Naval supremacy across every major ocean, not just the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf. The US Navy didn't just protect American shores, it protected the sea lanes that carried global trade. And in doing so, it made itself indispensable to every nation that depended on that trade, which was all of them. Britain had controlled the choke points, Gibraltar, Suez, Singapore. America went further. America controlled the ocean itself. Then there was the dollar system. With the world's major currencies pegged to the dollar, America gained something economists call seigniorage, the privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency. In practical terms, this meant America could run deficits that would bankrupt any other nation, because the world needed dollars to function and would always absorb American debt. It's a privilege so extraordinary that French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in 1965 called it America's exorbitant privilege. He meant it as a complaint. He was also, whether he intended to or not, paying America the highest possible compliment. Because exorbitant privilege doesn't happen by accident. It has to be built, defended, constantly renewed. And America built it on 3 pillars that, taken together, formed something unprecedented in the history of great powers. The first pillar was military. Not just the size of the force, though the size was staggering, but the positioning. Bases in Germany, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, the Gulf. A global presence that made American power not just reactive, but ambient. You didn't have to see it to feel it. The second pillar was financial. The dollar system, the IMF, the World Bank, Wall Street's growing dominance of global capital markets. Money moves through systems. America built the systems. And the builder of the system always has access that no one else has. The third pillar was cultural, and this one is the most underestimated. Hollywood, American music, American universities, American English spreading as the global language of business, science, and diplomacy. The blue jeans and the Coca-Cola and the rock and roll that moved through the Iron Curtain in ways that no missile ever could. Soft power. The ability to make the world want what you have. Britain had hard power. Armies, navies, governors general. America had something more durable. America made the world dream in American. And when you control what people dream about, you don't need to control everything else, because everything else tends to follow. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable, and I think you already sense it. Because if you're watching this, you're probably old enough to remember an America that felt different from the one we're living in now. Not perfect, America was never perfect, but there was a weight to it, a solidity, a sense that the center would hold. Something shifted. And the question isn't whether it shifted, the question is when and why. Let's go back to 1971. Richard Nixon, August 15th, a Sunday evening television address that most Americans watched without fully understanding what they were watching. Nixon announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at the fixed rate established at Bretton Woods. Just like that, the anchor was gone. Economists call it the Nixon shock. What it meant, in practical terms, was that the dollar was no longer backed by anything physical. It was backed by trust, by the credibility of the United States government, by the belief, which had to be constantly renewed, constantly earned, that America was good for it. Now, that system has worked. For decades, it has worked remarkably well. The dollar remained the world's reserve currency, not because of gold, but because of American institutional credibility, military reach, and the sheer size and depth of American financial markets. But something else happened in 1971 that rarely gets mentioned in the same breath. American manufacturing began its long, slow retreat. The post-war economic boom had been built in large part on American industrial capacity, factories, steel, automobiles, the physical making of things. And in the 1970s, as Japan and Germany rebuilt their industrial bases with newer equipment and lower costs, American manufacturers began to struggle. The response over the following decades was not to reinvent the industrial base. It was to financialize, to move the center of American economic gravity from making things to moving money, from factories to financial instruments, from Main Street to Wall Street. And for a long time, that looked like a success story. The numbers were extraordinary. Markets boomed. Wealth accumulated. America remained, by every conventional measure, the dominant economy on Earth. But wealth accumulation and broad prosperity are not the same thing. And somewhere in that gap, between the extraordinary wealth at the top and the quietly hollowing middle, something in the social contract started to fray. The towns that used to make steel, the regions that used to make furniture, textiles, electronics, the men and women who built their identity around skilled work and found, over 2 or 3 decades, that the work had moved. To Mexico, to China, to somewhere that wasn't here. This isn't a political statement. It's a structural observation. Empires that financialize tend to lose touch with the physical foundations of their power. Rome did it. Britain did it in its final decades, becoming more dependent on financial services and less on the industrial and military capacity that had built the empire in the first place. And then there's the cost of primacy itself. Maintaining global dominance is extraordinarily expensive. The naval presence across 7 seas, the bases in 80 countries, the wars, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, fought not always for clear national interest, but for the maintenance of a global order that America had appointed itself to protect. Vietnam alone cost more than the entire Marshall Plan in inflation-adjusted terms. And unlike the Marshall Plan, it produced no allies, no open markets, no institutional architecture that served American interests. It produced, instead, a crisis of confidence that took a generation to process. And yet the machinery kept running. Because when you are the architect of the global system, stepping back isn't simple. The system depends on you, and you, whether you like it or not, have become dependent on the system depending on you. That's the trap that Britain never fully escaped either. You build something so large, so interconnected, so globally load-bearing, that you can no longer afford to put it down, even when carrying it is breaking you. Britain carried it until it couldn't. Until 2 world wars and a depression and the sheer arithmetic of overextension made the carrying impossible. And then, quietly, it handed the weight to America. The question that hangs in the air now, the question that serious people in Washington and Beijing and Brussels are thinking about, even if they're not saying it out loud, is whether America is approaching that same moment, not collapse. Empires rarely collapse the way movies suggest. They transition. They hand the weight to someone else, or they find a way to carry it differently. That answer isn't written yet, but history, if you read it carefully enough, gives you a sense of the shape of what's coming. And that shape is what we need to talk about next. Before I take you into what comes next, and I promise we're almost there, I want to stop for just a second. If you've made it this far with me, through Bretton Woods and Nixon and the long arc of American power, you're not here by accident. You're the kind of person who wants to understand the world as it actually is, not the version that's comfortable, not the version that fits neatly into a headline or a talking point, the real version. And that's exactly who this channel exists for. So if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Hit that button. Because what we're building here, week after week, is a map. A way of reading the world that most people never get access to. And I don't want you to miss what's coming next. All right, back to the map. Because here's where it gets fascinating. The world being built right now, the one taking shape beneath the noise of daily news cycles and political arguments, doesn't look like the old world. And it doesn't look like the simple story of American decline that some people are eager to tell. It looks like something more complicated, more interesting, and in some ways, more dangerous. Let's start with China. For the past 4 decades, China did something remarkably familiar. It plugged itself into the American-built global system. It used dollar-denominated trade, American-designed institutions, and access to American consumer markets to industrialize at a speed that has no precedent in human history. In 1980, China's GDP was smaller than the Netherlands. Today, it is the second largest economy on Earth. By some measures of purchasing power, already the largest. But here's what's changed in the last decade. China stopped simply operating within the American system. It started building alternatives to it. The Belt and Road Initiative, infrastructure investment across Asia, Africa, and Latin America that now touches over 140 countries. Not Marshall Plan generosity, cold, deliberate strategic positioning. Ports, roads, railways, digital infrastructure. The physical connective tissue of a parallel global order. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, a multilateral lending institution designed to compete with the World Bank on terms that Washington doesn't set. The push to internationalize the yuan. Bilateral trade agreements denominated not in dollars, but in local currencies. Oil deals between China and Gulf states settled outside the dollar system entirely. Sound familiar? It should, because it's the same playbook America ran against Britain between 1944 and 1971. Build the institutions. Control the infrastructure. Make yourself indispensable to enough countries that the alternative, a world without your system, becomes unthinkable. But here's where the analogy breaks down, and this is important. America replaced Britain from a position of extraordinary strength, industrial capacity that dwarfed every other nation on Earth, a continent untouched by the wars that had devastated Europe and Asia, a population that was young, educated, and confident in a way that post-war exhaustion had made impossible elsewhere. China's challenge is different, more constrained, a demographic crisis built into its own history, a middle-income trap that economists have been debating for a decade. A political system that generates efficiency but struggles with the kind of institutional trust that makes a reserve currency work over generations. And then there's the dollar itself. Despite everything, despite the deficits, despite the political dysfunction, despite the wars and the crises and the moments where American credibility seemed genuinely in question, the dollar has remained dominant, resilient, the place the world runs to, even now, when fear moves through global markets. That's not nothing. That's actually extraordinary. Because it means that whatever transition is coming, and something is coming, history doesn't stop. It won't be simple. It won't be clean. It won't look like one empire handing a briefcase to another in a Swiss hotel lobby. It will look like the world we're already living in. Messy, multipolar, full of competing systems and parallel institutions and countries that hedge, that trade with China and bank with America, and belong to alliances that would have made no sense 20 years ago. The British didn't wake up one morning and decide to hand the world to America. It happened in 1,000 small moments, each one logical, each one, in isolation, survivable, until suddenly it wasn't. That's the nature of historical transitions. They feel gradual until they feel sudden. And right now, somewhere in the gap between gradual and sudden, we are all living. There's an old idea, older than America, older than Britain, older than most of the institutions we've been talking about today. The idea that power doesn't disappear, it moves. Like water finding a new path through rock, like heat transferring from one surface to another, like the tide that pulls back from one shore and arrives quietly on another. The British Empire didn't vanish, it transformed. Its legal systems still govern former colonies. Its language still carries the world's commerce. Its financial architecture, modified, extended, absorbed, still runs beneath the surface of institutions headquartered in Washington and Geneva and Singapore. Empires leave ghosts, and America, whatever comes next, will leave ghosts too. The question worth sitting with, the one that I think you came here today to think about, even if you didn't know how to name it, isn't whether America will remain the world's sole superpower forever. History has already answered that question for every empire that ever asked it. The question is what America chooses to do with the time it has, because this is the part that gets lost in the noise, in the geopolitical analysis and the GDP projections and the think tank papers about multipolar world orders. Empires are not abstractions. They are people, choices, habits of mind. The decision, made 1,000 times a day by 1,000 different actors, to build something or extract something, to invest or to consume, to look outward or to turn inward. Britain, in its final decades of dominance, made a series of choices that seemed rational in isolation and catastrophic in aggregate. It chose finance over industry. It chose the maintenance of prestige over the hard work of adaptation. It chose, again and again, the version of itself it had already been over the version it needed to become. America is making choices right now. Some of them look familiar. But familiarity isn't destiny. And the fact that a pattern has repeated before doesn't mean it must repeat again. What separates the empires that transition gracefully from the ones that collapse ungracefully isn't strength, it's honesty. The willingness to look at the map clearly, to see what's actually there, not what you wish were there, not what used to be there, and to move accordingly. Britain had men who saw it clearly. Keynes saw it. Churchill, in his darker moments, saw it. They didn't always have the power to change the outcome, but they saw it. America has always produced people who see clearly. That capacity, critical, restless, uncomfortable with comfortable lies, is perhaps the most genuinely American thing there is. More American even than the power itself. So, here's what I'll leave you with. The world has changed hands before. It will change hands again. And the story of how it changes, the decisions made in conference rooms and parliaments and factories and living rooms by ordinary people trying to understand extraordinary times, that story isn't finished. You're in it, right now, today, in the choices you make about what to understand, what to pay attention to, what to pass on to the people around you. History isn't something that happened to other people in other centuries. It's happening here. It's happening now. And the people who understand it, really understand it, not just the headlines, but the architecture underneath, are the ones who navigate what comes next without being swept away by it. That's why we do this. Every week on this channel, we try to read the map a little more clearly, to understand not just what's happening, but why. Not just the event, but the system underneath the event. If that's the kind of thinking you want more of, subscribe. Share this with 5 people who are asking the same questions you're asking, because the conversation is better when more serious people are in it. And leave me a comment, not just a thumbs up. Tell me what landed. Tell me what you're still thinking about. Tell me what you want to understand next. Because this channel goes where the questions lead, and I have a feeling you have a few good ones left.